Detective Sarah Martinez had seen her share of domestic violence cases in her 12 years with the Phoenix Police Department, but nothing had prepared her for the sight of 3-year-old Emma Miller sitting motionless in the sterile hospital room. The tiny girl clutched a worn pink stuffed rabbit against her chest, her enormous brown eyes staring at the acoustic ceiling tiles as if they held the secrets of the universe. Her small legs, barely reaching the edge of the oversized hospital chair, swung back and forth in a mechanical rhythm that seemed to be the only movement keeping her tethered to reality. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across Emma's pale face. Her dark curls, once probably bouncy and full of life, now hung limp around her shoulders, still bearing traces of dried blood that the nurses hadn't quite managed to wash away completely. A small bandage covered a cut on her forehead where she had apparently hit something during the chaos of that terrible night 3 days ago. Sarah approached slowly, her heavy boots making soft squeaking sounds against the polished linoleum floor. She had learned over the years that children were like wounded animals. Sudden movements or loud noises could send them retreating deeper into their shells. She pulled up a small plastic chair, the kind designed for visitors in pediatric wards, and positioned herself at Emma's eye level. "Hi there, sweetheart," Sarah said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Detective Martinez, but you can call me Sarah if you want. I'm here to help you and your mommy." Emma's eyes flickered toward the detective for just a moment before returning to their fixed position on the ceiling. Her grip on the stuffed rabbit tightened almost imperceptibly, but she remained as silent as stone. Sarah had read the preliminary reports, knew the basic facts that had brought them to this moment, but seeing the aftermath written across a child's face was something entirely different. Through the thin hospital wall, she could hear the steady beeping of machines in the next room, where Emma's mother, Rebecca Miller, lay unconscious. The 28-year-old woman had suffered a severe concussion, 3 broken ribs, a fractured orbital bone, and internal bleeding that had required emergency surgery. The attending physician, Dr. James Patterson, had told Sarah privately that Rebecca was lucky to be alive. Another few minutes of David Miller's rage, and Emma would have been orphaned that night. Sarah glanced at her notepad, though she barely needed to reference it. The details were burned into her memory. Neighbors had called 911 after hearing screaming and crashing sounds coming from the Miller apartment around 10:30 p.m. When officers arrived, they found David Miller attempting to flee through the back door, his knuckles bloody and his clothes disheveled. Rebecca was unconscious on the kitchen floor, surrounded by shattered dishes and overturned furniture that painted a vivid picture of the violence that had occurred. Emma had been found hiding in the bedroom closet, wedged behind a pile of winter coats, still wearing her Frozen-themed pajamas that were now stained with her mother's blood. Officer Janet Rodriguez, first on the scene, had described finding the little girl as one of the most heartbreaking moments of her career. Emma hadn't cried, hadn't screamed, hadn't even acknowledged the officer's presence when she was gently coaxed out of her hiding place. "Emma," Sarah tried again, her voice gentle but persistent. "I know you're scared, and I know that what happened was very frightening. But your mommy needs our help to make sure she stays safe. Can you help us?" "Help your mommy?" The child's breathing was steady, but shallow, her small chest rising and falling in a pattern that suggested she was actively working to remain calm. Child psychologist Dr. Rebecca Chon had already conducted a preliminary assessment, noting that Emma was displaying classic signs of acute trauma response. The selective mutism, the 1,000-yard stare, the way she flinched whenever an adult male entered the room, all textbook indicators of a child who had witnessed something no person, let alone a toddler, should ever have to see. Sarah reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small coloring book and a box of crayons. She had learned that sometimes children could express what they couldn't verbalize through art, She placed them gently on the small table beside Emma's chair. "These are for you, if you want them," she said. "Sometimes it helps to draw pictures when we can't find the words." For the first time, Emma's eyes moved from the ceiling. She looked at the coloring book Disney princesses adorned the cover, and then back at Sarah. Her hand released its death grip on the stuffed rabbit, just long enough to touch the corner of the book, before quickly returning to its protective position. The door opened quietly, and Emma's maternal grandmother, Rosa Gonzalez, entered carrying a cup of coffee and wearing the same clothes she'd thrown on when she received the middle of the night phone call that had turned her world upside down. Rosa's eyes were red-rimmed from crying and lack of sleep, but she managed a weak smile when she saw her granddaughter. "Mia," Rosa whispered, settling into another chair beside Emma. "Abuela is here." Emma's reaction to her grandmother was subtle but noticeable. Her rigid posture softened slightly, and she leaned almost imperceptibly in Rosa's direction. It was the first human connection Sarah had observed since arriving at the hospital. "Mrs. Gonzalez," Sarah said quietly, acknowledging the older woman. With a respectful nod, "How is she doing with you?" Rosa's weathered hands smoothed Emma's hair with infinite tenderness. "She hasn't spoken since they brought her here," she said, her accent thick with emotion. "The doctors say there's nothing physically wrong with her voice, but she just won't talk. She wakes up screaming from nightmares, but during the day, nothing. It's like she's locked herself away, somewhere we can't reach." Sarah nodded, understanding the gravity of what they were facing. Emma wasn't just their only witness to David Miller's violent assault on his wife. She was a traumatized child whose ability to testify could determine whether a dangerous man spent years in prison or walked free to potentially hurt someone else. The weight of justice rested on the shoulders of a 3-year-old who had quite literally lost her voice when she needed it most. As if sensing the adult's concern, Emma finally turned her head and looked directly at Sarah for the first time. In those deep brown eyes, the detective saw fear, confusion, and something else that broke her heart, a plea for help that the little girl couldn't yet put into words. Assistant District Attorney Michael Rodriguez stood at his office window on the 15th floor of the Maricopa County Attorney's Office, watching the Phoenix skyline shimmer in the desert heat. Case files were scattered across his mahogany desk. Like fallen dominoes, each folder representing another domestic violence case that had crumbled without sufficient evidence. 3 cases in the past 6 months alone had collapsed when victims recanted their testimony or key witnesses disappeared into the shadows of fear. But Emma Miller's case was different. This wasn't about an adult victim who might change her mind or be intimidated into silence. This was about a 3-year-old child who held the key to justice in her tiny, trembling hands that hadn't spoken a word since witnessing her father's brutal assault on her mother. Rodriguez turned back to his desk, picking up the preliminary police report for the 100th time. The black and white photographs of the crime scene were spread out before him like a grotesque puzzle. Shattered dishes littered the kitchen floor. Cabinet doors hung askew from their hinges, and dark stains on the linoleum told the story of violence that words couldn't adequately capture. But the most haunting image was the one taken inside the bedroom closet, a small indentation in the pile of winter coats where Emma had hidden, surrounded by her mother's blood-stained clothing that had been thrown about during the struggle. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. "Rodriguez here." "Michael, it's Dr. Rebecca Chun. I've completed my initial assessment of Emma Miller." The child psychologist's voice carried the weight of years spent working with traumatized children. But there was something particularly heavy in her tone today. "What's the verdict, Doc? Can she testify?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Michael, this child is exhibiting severe trauma response symptoms. Selective mutism is just the beginning. She's experiencing dissociation, hypervigilance, and what appears to be survivor's guilt at 3 years old. Forcing her into a courtroom environment could cause irreparable psychological damage. Rodriguez sank into his leather chair, running his hands through his graying hair. At 42, he had prosecuted hundreds of cases, but none had presented such an impossible moral dilemma. Dr. Chun, without Emma's testimony, David Miller walks free. He's already made bail, and his attorney is claiming that any evidence involving the child should be thrown out as unreliable. We have the physical evidence, the medical reports, but no adult witnesses. Emma is literally the only person who saw what happened that night. I understand the legal implications, but we're talking about a child who hasn't spoken to anyone except her grandmother, and even then, only in whispers. She flinches every time she hears a male voice. Yesterday, when a male orderly entered her hospital room, she wet herself out of fear. How do you expect her to sit in a courtroom full of strangers and recount the most traumatic experience of her life? Rodriguez pulled out another folder, one that made his stomach turn every time he opened it. David Miller's criminal history painted a portrait of escalating violence. Drunk and disorderly conduct in college, a bar fight that resulted in assault, charges that were later dropped, 2 previous domestic disturbance calls to the Miller residence that Rebecca had refused to pursue. The pattern was clear. David Miller was a man whose capacity for violence was growing, and without intervention, someone was going to die. Dr. Chun, help me understand something, Rodriguez said, leaning back in his chair. Is there any way, method or technique that might help Emma communicate what she witnessed? Maybe not traditional testimony, but something that could be admissible in court? The psychologist was quiet for a moment. Rodriguez could hear paper shuffling in the background. There are some experimental approaches. Play therapy sometimes helps children express trauma through dolls or drawings. Some jurisdictions have used closed-circuit testimony to reduce the intimidation factor. But Michael, even if we could get Emma to communicate, there's another problem. What's that, Jonathan Hayes? Rodriguez grimaced at the mention of David Miller's defense attorney. Hayes was one of the most ruthless criminal defense lawyers in Arizona, known for his ability to tear apart prosecution cases with surgical precision. He was particularly effective at discrediting witness testimony, and Rodriguez could already imagine the field day Hayes would have with a 3-year-old witness. He's already filed preliminary motions, Rodriguez said, flipping through a stack of legal documents, claiming that any testimony from Emma would be inherently unreliable due to her age and traumatic state. He's citing precedent cases where children's testimony was thrown out for being fantastical or coached. He's also requesting a competency hearing to determine if Emma even understands the difference between truth and fiction. The office door opened, and Rodriguez's assistant, Maria Santos, peered in apologetically. I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's been a development. Rebecca Miller is awake. Rodriguez felt a surge of hope mixed with anxiety. How is she? Can she speak? The doctors say she's stable, but she has significant memory loss from the head trauma. She remembers fragments of that night, but nothing concrete enough to build a case on. And Michael ... double quotes. Maria hesitated. David Miller's attorney is already at the hospital, trying to get permission to interview her. Over my dead body, Rodriguez muttered, reaching for his jacket. Dr. Chun, I need to go. But think about what we discussed. There has to be a way to help Emma tell her story without destroying her in the process. After hanging up, Rodriguez stood in his office, surrounded by the detritus of a legal system that too often failed the most vulnerable. On his wall hung his law school diploma and a photograph of his own daughter at Emma's age, bright, innocent, trusting. The parallel wasn't lost on him. If something happened to his child, if she were the only witness to a violent crime, what would he want the system to do? The irony was crushing. Emma Miller had witnessed her father's attempt to murder. Her mother, but the very trauma that made her testimony crucial, also made it nearly impossible to obtain. The justice system, designed to protect the innocent, was failing a 3-year-old girl who needed it most. As Rodriguez gathered his files and prepared to head to the hospital, his phone rang again. This time it was his boss, District Attorney Patricia Webb. "Michael, I just got off the phone with the mayor's office. The Miller case is attracting media attention. Channel 12 is already running stories about domestic violence in affluent neighborhoods. We need to be very careful how we proceed. If we traumatize that child in pursuit of a conviction, we'll have every child advocacy group in the state coming after us. But if David Miller walks free and hurts someone else, ... She didn't need to finish the sentence. Rodriguez understood the impossible position they were in. Justice for Rebecca Miller and protection for future victims hung in the balance, and the key to both lay locked in the traumatized mind of a little girl who had forgotten how to speak. "I'll find a way. Patricia, I have to." Officer Lisa Park had always believed that dogs understood human pain in ways that people couldn't. As she watched her partner Rex, a magnificent German shepherd with intelligent amber eyes and a gentle soul, carefully approach the trembling child in the hospital's family consultation room, she felt that familiar tightness in her chest that came with witnessing profound suffering. Rex wasn't just any police dog. While most canine units were trained for drug detection, explosives, or apprehension, Rex belonged to the Phoenix Police Department's Specialized Victim Services. Unit 1 of only 12 therapy dogs in the entire state, trained specifically to work with trauma victims. His certification had taken 18 months of intensive training, learning to read human emotions, provide comfort without overwhelming, and remain calm in the most chaotic situations. Detective Sarah Martinez had called Lisa that morning with an unusual request. "I know this sounds crazy," Sarah had said over the phone, "but I've got a 3-year-old witness who hasn't spoken since she watched her father nearly kill her mother. The psychologists are stumped, the prosecutors are desperate, and this little girl is carrying the weight of justice on her shoulders." Rex has worked miracles with trauma victims before. Maybe he could help Emma find her voice. Lisa had hesitated. Rex had worked with dozens of victims, adult women fleeing abusive relationships, elderly people who'd been robbed, teenagers who'd been assaulted, but never with a child this young, and certainly never in a case where the child's testimony could make or break a criminal prosecution. Now, sitting in the sterile hospital room, Lisa watched Emma Miller with the trained eye of someone who'd spent 5 years helping trauma victims begin their healing process. The little girl sat rigid in an oversized chair, her legs dangling, like a broken marionette's, clutching a pink stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. Her dark eyes held that hollow look Lisa had seen too, many times, the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd witnessed unspeakable violence. "Emma," Lisa said softly, keeping her voice low and non-threatening, "I'd like you to meet my friend Rex. He's very gentle, and he loves children. Would it be okay if he came closer?" Emma's eyes flickered toward the massive German shepherd but quickly returned to her fixed stare at the acoustic ceiling tiles. Rex, sensing the child's fear, lowered himself to the floor, making himself as non-threatening as possible. His training had taught him to read body language, and everything about Emma screamed vulnerability and terror. Dr. Rebecca Chon sat quietly in the corner, her notebook balanced on her lap, observing every micro-expression and subtle movement. She'd been working with Emma for 3 days, trying every technique in her considerable arsenal: play therapy with dolls, art therapy with crayons, even music therapy with soft lullabies. Nothing had broken through the wall of silence the child had built around herself. "Rex is what we call a therapy dog," Lisa continued, her voice barely above a whisper. That means his job is to help people feel safe and loved. He's helped lots of people who were scared, just like you. Emma's grandmother, Rosa Gonzalez, sat on the opposite side of the room, her weathered hands twisted in her lap. She'd been Emma's primary caregiver since the attack, the only person the child would acknowledge with even the slightest response. Mia, Rosa whispered in Spanish. El perrito es bueno. He's a good dog. Rex began to move, but not toward Emma. Instead, he approached Rosa first, understanding instinctively that gaining the grandmother's acceptance would help the child feel safer. He placed his massive head gently on Rosa's knee, and she couldn't help but smile through her tears as she stroked his soft fur. "Oh, what a beautiful boy you are," Rosa murmured, and for the first time since entering the room, Emma's head turned slightly toward the interaction. Lisa noticed the subtle movement immediately. "Rex has been working with the police department for 3 years now," she said, continuing the conversation as if Emma were actively participating. "He's helped children who were lost find their way back to their families. He's comforted people who were hurt, and sometimes he just sits with people who need a friend." Rex seemed to understand that he was being discussed. He lifted his head from Rosa's knee and looked directly at Emma, his tail giving the slightest wag. Then, moving with the patience that had made him exceptional at his job, he began to inch closer to Emma's chair. Emma's breathing quickened, but she didn't retreat. Her grip on the stuffed rabbit loosened slightly, as Rex positioned himself about 3 feet away from her chair, close enough to be comforting, but far enough away to not feel threatening. Dr. Chun made a note in her pad, recognizing the significance of Emma's lack of flight response. In their previous sessions, the child had shown signs of hypervigilance and an exaggerated startle response to unexpected movements. Rex's approach hadn't triggered those defensive mechanisms. "You know what I think, Emma?" Lisa said, settling cross-legged on the floor beside Rex. "I think Rex can tell that you're very brave. Dogs are smart that way. They can sense when someone has been through something scary and they want to help." Emma's eyes moved from the ceiling to Rex's face. The German Shepherd remained perfectly still, as if he understood the delicate nature of this moment. His amber eyes met Emma's brown ones, and something passed between them, a recognition of pain, perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement that sometimes the world could be a frightening place. Minutes passed in silence, but it was different from Emma's previous silence. This wasn't the frozen terror of trauma. This was the quiet of consideration, of a child deciding whether to trust. Then, barely audible, came a sound that made every adult in the room hold their breath. Emma giggled. It was soft, brief, but unmistakably real, the first sound of joy anyone had heard from her since that terrible night. Rex's tail wagged harder, and he took one careful step closer. Emma's hand, still clutching the rabbit, moved slightly in his direction. "Hello, doggy," Emma whispered, her voice rusty from disuse, but clear as crystal. Dr. Chan's pen froze mid-note. Detective Martinez, who had been watching from the doorway, felt tears spring to her eyes. Rosa crossed herself and whispered a prayer of gratitude in Spanish. But it was Lisa who understood the full significance of the moment. Rex hadn't just helped Emma speak, he'd given her a reason to trust again. And in a case where everything hinged on a 3-year-old's ability to tell her story, trust was the most crucial element of all. Emma extended her small hand toward Rex, and the German Shepherd gently placed his nose in her palm. For the first time in days, Emma smiled. Judge Patricia Williams had presided over family court for 21 years, watching the legal system evolve from rigid formality to a more compassionate understanding of human trauma. But as she sat in her chambers, reviewing the unprecedented motion before her, she knew she was about to make a decision that would either revolutionize the way courts handle child witnesses or become the biggest mistake of her judicial career. The motion, filed by Assistant District Attorney Michael Rodriguez, was unlike anything in Arizona legal precedent. A request to allow a therapy dog to accompany a 3-year-old witness during testimony. Williams had spent her weekend researching similar cases across the country, finding scattered examples from progressive jurisdictions, but nothing that provided clear guidance for such an extraordinary situation. Her intercom buzzed. "Your Honor, Jonathan Hayes is here for the emergency hearing." Williams straightened her black robes and steeled herself for what she knew would be an aggressive challenge from the defense attorney. Hayes entered her chambers. Like a storm front, his expensive suit immaculate, his briefcase stuffed with legal briefs and precedent cases designed to demolish the prosecution's unconventional request. "Your Honor," Hayes began before he'd even fully seated himself, "this motion is nothing more than a theatrical attempt to manipulate the jury's emotions. Allowing a police dog in the courtroom during testimony creates an inherently prejudicial environment that violates my client's right to a fair trial." Williams nodded toward the chair across from her desk. "Sit down, Mr. Hayes. Let's discuss this properly." Rodriguez arrived moments later, looking like he'd slept in his office, which, given the circumstances, he probably had. Dark circles rimmed his eyes, and his usually crisp shirt was wrinkled from hours of poring over case law and psychological studies. "Counselors," Williams began, "I've reviewed both of your submissions. Mr. Hayes, you've cited 17 cases where emotional support animals were excluded from courtrooms. Mr. Rodriguez, you've provided documentation showing therapeutic benefits and 3 cases from other jurisdictions where similar accommodations were made. What I need to understand is whether we can ensure a fair trial while providing appropriate support for a traumatized child witness." Hayes leaned forward aggressively. "Your Honor, this child is 3 years old. The psychological literature clearly shows that children this young are susceptible to suggestion, have difficulty distinguishing reality from fantasy, and lack the cognitive development necessary for reliable testimony. Adding an emotional manipulation device, which is exactly what this dog represents, turns this courtroom into a circus. That child is the only witness to a brutal assault that nearly killed her mother," Rodriguez countered, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Dr. Rebecca Chon's report indicates that Emma Miller has made remarkable progress in the presence of the therapy dog. For the first time since the attack, she's communicating. Without Rex, we have no testimony at all." Williams had read Dr. Chun's report 3 times, noting the psychologist's careful documentation of Emma's breakthrough moments with the German Shepherd. The child who had been locked in traumatic silence for weeks was now drawing pictures and whispering stories to the therapy dog, recounting details of that horrific night that corroborated the physical evidence. "Mr. Hayes," Williams said, "what specific prejudice do you claim the dog's presence would create?" "Your Honor, the mere sight of a police dog creates an impression of law enforcement authority and credibility. Jurors will subconsciously associate the child's testimony with police validation. Furthermore, the emotional manipulation is obvious. Who can challenge a 3-year-old girl sitting with a gentle dog? It's designed to make my client appear monstrous by comparison." Rodriguez pulled out a folder containing photographs from their practice sessions with Emma and Rex. "Your Honor, we're not asking for special consideration to manipulate emotions. We're asking for reasonable accommodation for a witness with special needs. Emma has formed a therapeutic bond with Rex that allows her to communicate trauma she cannot otherwise express. This isn't manipulation, it's accessibility." Williams studied the photographs Rodriguez had provided. They showed Emma sitting beside Rex in a mock courtroom setup they'd created at the courthouse's Family Services Center. In the images, the child appeared calm, engaged, and for the first time since the attack, genuinely present rather than dissociated. "I've also received a letter from the Arizona Coalition Against Domestic Violence," Williams noted, pulling out another document. They're requesting that I allow this accommodation, stating that it could set a precedent for helping other child witnesses in similar situations. Hayes's jaw tightened. Your Honor, emotional appeals from advocacy groups shouldn't influence judicial decisions. The law is clear about courtroom procedures, and nowhere in Arizona statute does it provide for therapy animals during witness testimony. Mr. Hayes, Williams replied coolly, the law also requires us to make reasonable accommodations for witnesses with special needs. The Americans with Disabilities Act applies to courtrooms and trauma-related communication disorders fall under disability protections. The judge turned to Rodriguez. What safeguards are you proposing to address the defense's concerns about potential prejudice? Rodriguez had clearly prepared for this question. We propose that Rex be introduced to the jury as a medical accommodation, similar to how we might introduce a wheelchair or hearing aid. We'll instruct the jury that the dog's presence is solely to help the witness communicate and should not be considered evidence of any kind. Officer Park will handle Rex throughout the proceedings, and the dog will remain in a designated area. Beside the witness stand, Williams nodded thoughtfully. And Dr. Chun supports this approach. Completely, Your Honor. She believes Emma's ability to testify depends entirely on Rex's presence. Without the dog, Emma retreats into selective mutism. With Rex, she demonstrates remarkable recall and verbal communication ability. Hayes shuffled through his papers, pulling out another legal brief. Your Honor, I have affidavits from 3 child psychology experts who disagree with Dr. Chun's assessment. They argue that this therapeutic dependency could actually indicate that the child's testimony is unreliable, as she may be confusing reality with the fantasy relationships children often form with animals. The room fell silent as Williams considered the competing arguments. Through her chamber windows, she could see the courthouse plaza where media vans had begun gathering. Word of the unusual case had leaked, and reporters were already framing it as a David versus Goliath story of a little girl and her dog taking on the legal system. Gentlemen, Williams finally said, I'm going to allow a limited trial run. Tomorrow morning, we'll conduct an in-camera session with Emma, Rex, and a court reporter. I want to observe firsthand how the child responds to questioning in a formal courtroom environment. Based on that assessment, I'll make my final ruling on whether to allow the dog during actual testimony. Hayes started to object, but Williams held up her hand. Mr. Hayes, your client's right to a fair trial is paramount, but so is this court's obligation to ensure that justice can be served. If Emma Miller cannot testify without this accommodation, then your client benefits from her silence just as surely as if we allowed prejudicial evidence. We'll proceed carefully, but we will proceed. As both attorneys left her chambers, Williams remained at her desk, staring at the motion that could define her judicial legacy. Tomorrow, she would decide whether the law could evolve to protect its most vulnerable witnesses, or whether centuries of legal tradition would silence a 3-year-old girl's cry for justice. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Maricopa County Superior Court as Emma Miller walked through the imposing double doors, her tiny hand engulfed in her grandmother Rose's weathered grip. She wore her favorite purple dress, the one with tiny butterflies embroidered along the hem that her mother had bought her for her 3rd birthday just 2 months before their world shattered. Rosa had insisted on the dress, believing that familiar things might provide comfort in this most unfamiliar of places. Emma's dark eyes, wide with a mixture of curiosity and terror, took in the cavernous lobby with its soaring ceilings and echoing footsteps. Court officers moved with practiced efficiency, their heavy boots creating a rhythmic percussion against the polished stone. The child pressed closer to her grandmother, her free hand clutching the pink stuffed rabbit that had become her constant companion since that terrible night. Detective Sarah Martinez met them at the security checkpoint, her usually stern expression softened by genuine concern for the little girl she'd watched slowly emerge from traumatic silence over the past weeks. "Good morning, Emma," she said gently, kneeling to the child's eye level. "Rex is already here, and he's very excited to see you." At the mention of the German shepherd's name, Emma's rigid posture relaxed slightly. Over the past 2 weeks, she had spent countless hours with Rex in the courthouse's family services room, gradually building the trust that everyone hoped would translate into today's crucial testimony. She had drawn pictures for Rex, shared her crackers with him during snack time, and most importantly, begun to whisper the details of that horrific night into his patient, furry ears. The gallery was already filling with an unusual crowd for a domestic violence case. Court reporters from 3 local television stations had claimed seats in the back rows, their cameras ready to capture what many were calling a landmark moment in child witness accommodation. Representatives from child advocacy groups sat alongside domestic violence counselors, all understanding that today's proceedings could establish precedent for countless future cases. Dr. Rebecca Chun arrived carrying a leather satchel filled with assessment tools and comfort items, additional crayons, a small blanket, and a photograph of Emma's mother that the child sometimes asked to see during their therapy sessions. The psychologist had spent a sleepless night reviewing her notes and preparing for every possible scenario that might unfold once Emma took the witness stand. "She's been asking about Rex since she woke up this morning," Rosa whispered to Dr. Chun in Spanish, her voice tight with anxiety. "She ate only a few bites of breakfast, but she insisted on wearing this dress because Rex likes purple. I don't know if she understands what's really happening today." As they made their way toward the courtroom, Emma suddenly stopped walking. Through the narrow window in the courtroom door, she had spotted her father, David Miller, sitting at the defendant's table. Her entire body went rigid, and the familiar 1,000-yard stare returned to her eyes, the same blank expression that had characterized her behavior in the immediate aftermath of the attack. David Miller looked nothing like the rage-filled man who had terrorized his family that night. Clean-shaven and dressed in a conservative Navy suit selected by his attorney, he appeared to be just another professional facing legal proceedings. But Emma's primal recognition of him as a source of danger was immediate and visceral. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, and she began to back away from the courtroom door. "Emma, sweetheart," Dr. Chun said softly, recognizing the signs of an approaching panic response. "Remember what we talked about? Rex is in there waiting for you. He's going to sit right beside you, just like we practiced." Inside the courtroom, Officer Lisa Park was making final preparations with Rex. The German shepherd sat calmly beside the witness stand, his therapy dog vest clearly identifying his role to anyone who entered. Park had arrived early to ensure that Rex was completely settled before Emma's arrival, knowing that the dog's demeanor would directly influence the child's ability to function in this intimidating environment. Judge Patricia Williams took her position at the bench, her black robes a stark contrast to the warm smile she offered Emma as the little girl finally entered the courtroom. Williams had spent her career working with children in family court, but she had never faced a situation quite like this one. The weight of legal precedent, media attention, and most importantly, a traumatized child's well-being rested squarely on her shoulders. Assistant District Attorney Michael Rodriguez sat at the prosecution table, his opening questions carefully crafted to be as gentle and non-threatening as possible. He had practiced the examination with child development experts, learning to speak in simple terms that a 3-year-old could understand, while still eliciting the specific details needed to build a case against David Miller. At the defense table, Jonathan Hayes reviewed his notes one final time. His strategy was delicate. He needed to challenge the reliability of a 3-year-old's testimony without appearing to attack a traumatized child. The presence of Rex complicated his approach significantly, as any aggressive cross-examination would look particularly harsh when directed at a little girl sitting beside a therapy dog. The jury box filled with 12 citizens who had been carefully selected for their ability to fairly assess testimony from such an unusual witness. During voir dire, several potential jurors had been dismissed when they expressed either excessive sympathy for child victims or skepticism about the reliability of young children's accounts. Those who remained understood they were participating in something unprecedented in Arizona legal history. Emma's steps slowed as she approached the witness stand. The elevated platform, designed for adult witnesses, seemed enormous from her perspective. The microphone looked like some sort of mechanical monster, and the formal atmosphere of the courtroom felt as foreign as another planet. Then she saw Rex. The German shepherd's tail began to wag the moment he spotted Emma, and his amber eyes seemed to communicate the same patience and understanding that had characterized their relationship from the very beginning. Emma's face transformed from terror to tentative relief as she realized her furry friend was exactly where he had promised to be. "Good morning, Emma," Judge Williams said warmly, her voice carefully modulated to be as non-threatening as possible. "Rex has been waiting very patiently for you. Would you like to sit beside him?" Emma nodded silently, her first communication of the day. As she climbed onto the witness stand with the help of a court officer, Rex moved closer, positioning himself exactly as they had practiced during their preparation sessions. The courtroom fell into complete silence as Emma settled into the witness chair, her small legs dangling several inches above the floor. She reached out tentatively and placed her hand on Rex's head, drawing strength from the familiar contact. Rodriguez stood slowly, knowing that the next few minutes would determine not only the fate of David Miller, but potentially the future of how the legal system accommodated its most vulnerable witnesses. The courtroom held its breath as Assistant District Attorney Michael Rodriguez approached the witness stand, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet that seemed to absorb not just sound, but the very tension that filled the air. Emma Miller sat in the oversized witness chair, her purple dress a small splash of color against the imposing mahogany backdrop, her tiny legs swinging nervously above the floor. Her hand rested on Rex's head, fingers buried deep in his soft fur, as if drawing strength from each stroke. "Good morning, Emma," Rodriguez said gently, positioning himself at a comfortable distance that wouldn't feel threatening to the child. He had spent hours practicing this moment with child development experts, learning to modulate his voice, control his body language, and ask questions in ways that a 3-year-old mind could process without feeling overwhelmed. Emma's dark eyes flickered toward him briefly before returning to Rex's patient face. The German shepherd sat perfectly still, his therapy training evident in the way he remained calm, despite the unusual environment and the palpable tension surrounding them. "Emma, can you tell us your name?" Rodriguez asked, starting with the simplest possible question. Silence stretched across the courtroom, like a taut wire. Emma's grip on Rex tightened, and her breathing became slightly more rapid. Judge Patricia Williams leaned forward almost imperceptibly, ready to intervene if the child showed signs of distress. Rodriguez tried again, this time incorporating Rex into the question. "Emma, can you tell Rex your name? I think he'd like to know." Emma looked down at the German shepherd, whose amber eyes seemed to encourage her with their gentle warmth. She opened her mouth slightly, but no sound emerged. The court reporter's fingers hovered motionlessly above her stenotype machine, waiting for words that might never come. David Miller sat at the defense table, his hands folded carefully in front of him, his attorney Jonathan Hayes having coached him to show no reaction, regardless of what his daughter might say. But even Miller seemed to hold his breath, understanding that his fate hung on the words of the 3-year-old girl he had terrorized. Dr. Rebecca Chun, positioned in the gallery where Emma could see her, made subtle encouraging gestures, Slight nod. A warm smile trying to remind the child of their practice sessions, where Emma had gradually learned to trust her own voice again. Minutes passed with only the soft sounds of shifting bodies and muffled breathing. Some jurors exchanged worried glances, wondering if they were witnessing the collapse of the prosecution's case in real time. The media representatives leaned forward in their seats, sensing that they might be documenting either a breakthrough moment in legal history or a heartbreaking failure of the justice system to protect its most vulnerable witnesses. Rodriguez made a decision that would either save the case or destroy it completely. Instead of continuing to direct questions at Emma, he knelt down beside Rex and began speaking directly to the dog. "Rex," he said conversationally, as if the German shepherd were just another witness, "I understand you've been spending time with Emma. Has she told you about her family?" The approach was unprecedented, but something about the indirect nature of the communication seemed to ease Emma's anxiety. She looked back and forth between Rodriguez and Rex, as if processing this new dynamic. Then, so quietly that the court reporter had to strain to hear, Emma whispered, "Rex knows about my mommy." The words were barely audible, but they electrified the courtroom. Judge Williams felt her heart skip a beat. Rodriguez carefully controlled his expression, knowing that any sign of excitement or victory might cause Emma to retreat back into silence. "Rex knows about your mommy?" Rodriguez repeated gently, maintaining the indirect conversation style. "What did you tell Rex about your mommy?" Emma leaned closer to Rex, pressing her face against his neck as she had done countless times during their therapy sessions. When she spoke again, her voice was slightly stronger, though still directed primarily at the dog. "I told Rex that Daddy made Mommy cry," she said, the words tumbling out in the innocent, matter-of-fact way that only a child could deliver such devastating testimony. Mommy was on the floor, and there was red stuff everywhere. The jury members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Several women dabbed at their eyes with tissues, while others stared intently at David Miller, whose carefully controlled expression was beginning to crack under the weight of his daughter's words. Hayes started to rise, perhaps to object to the unusual format of the testimony, but Judge Williams fixed him with a look that clearly communicated he should remain seated. This was uncharted legal territory, and she was not about to interrupt what might be the only opportunity for justice in this case. "The red stuff," Rodriguez continued carefully. "Did you tell Rex what the red stuff was?" Emma nodded against Rex's fur. "It was Mommy's blood," she said with the straightforward honesty that made her testimony both heartbreaking and compelling. "Daddy was making loud, angry sounds, and Mommy was scared. I was scared too, so I hid in the closet with my coats." The courtroom was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning system seemed deafening. Emma continued her conversation with Rex, unaware that every word was being transcribed and would soon become part of the legal record that would determine her father's fate. "I told Rex about the breaking sounds," she continued, her voice growing more confident as she lost herself in the familiar rhythm of sharing secrets with her furry friend. "Daddy threw the dishes, and they made crashing sounds. Then Mommy stopped making sounds, and that was the scariest part." Rodriguez felt a mixture of triumph and profound sadness. Emma's testimony was more detailed and compelling than anything he had hoped for, but listening to a 3-year-old describe witnessing attempted murder was almost unbearable. "Emma," he said gently, "when you were hiding in the closet, could you see what Daddy was doing to Mommy?" For a moment, Emma's flow of words stopped. She looked directly at her father for the first time since entering the courtroom, and the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. David Miller stared back at his daughter, and for just an instant, his mask of composure slipped, revealing something that made several jury members visibly recoil. Emma turned back to Rex, burying her face deeper in his fur. When she spoke again, her words would seal her father's fate and finally give voice to the truth that had been trapped inside her for so long. "Rex," she whispered, loud enough for the microphone to capture, "I saw Daddy hurt Mommy really, really bad. And I think he wanted to make her go away forever." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. "I think he wanted to make her go away forever." Emma's innocent voice, speaking directly to Rex about the most traumatic night of her young life, had just delivered testimony that would haunt everyone in the courtroom for years to come. A German shepherd remained perfectly still, his amber eyes fixed on the little girl, whose trust had finally unlocked the truth that the justice system desperately needed to hear. Assistant District Attorney Michael Rodriguez felt his chest tighten as he processed the weight of Emma's revelation. In his 15 years of prosecuting criminal cases, he had heard countless testimonies of violence and brutality, but nothing had prepared him for the stark innocence with which a 3-year-old could describe attempted murder. Emma's words weren't just testimony. They were a window into a child's understanding of evil, filtered through the lens of someone too young to fully comprehend the magnitude of what she had witnessed. "Emma," Rodriguez continued gently, careful not to break the magical connection between the child and her canine confidant, "when you told Rex about that night, did you tell him about the sounds Mommy was making?" Emma nodded against Rex's fur, her small fingers continuing to stroke the therapy dog's coat in a rhythmic motion that seemed to calm her. "Mommy was crying, but not like when she watches sad movies. It was different crying, scared crying. And then she made choking sounds, like when I drink water too fast." The courtroom stenographer's fingers flew across her machine, capturing every word of what legal experts would later call the most unprecedented child testimony in Arizona history. Judge Patricia Williams watched the proceedings with a mixture of fascination and profound concern, knowing that every moment was setting legal precedent while simultaneously hoping that the little girl on the witness stand would emerge from this experience without further psychological damage. At the defense table, Jonathan Hayes found himself in an impossible position. His client, David Miller, sat frozen, his carefully constructed facade cracking with each innocent revelation from his daughter. Hayes had built his career on aggressive cross-examination and challenging witness credibility. But how do you attack the testimony of a 3-year-old who is speaking more to a therapy dog than to the court? Any aggressive questioning would make him appear to be bullying a traumatized child, while failing to challenge the testimony could result in his client's conviction. "Did you tell Rex what Daddy was doing when Mommy was making those sounds?" Rodriguez asked, his voice maintaining the same gentle tone that had proven successful in keeping Emma talking. Emma's response was so matter-of-fact that it sent chills through the gallery. "Daddy had his hands on Mommy's neck, like when we play the squeezing game, but Mommy wasn't laughing. She was trying to push him away, but Daddy is bigger and stronger." Several jury members visibly recoiled at the description. Juror number 7, a mother of 2 young children, closed her eyes and took a deep breath, clearly struggling to maintain her composure. The foreman, a retired teacher who had worked with children for 30 years, stared directly at David Miller with unconcealed disgust. Dr. Rebecca Chun, observing from the gallery, marveled at Emma's ability to maintain her narrative flow. The child was demonstrating remarkable resilience, using her bond with Rex as an emotional anchor that allowed her to process and verbalize trauma that had previously been locked away in her psyche. Chun made careful notes about Emma's body language, her breathing patterns, and the way she instinctively sought comfort from the therapy dog whenever the memories became particularly difficult. "Emma, sweetheart," Rodriguez continued, "did you tell Rex what happened after Daddy stopped squeezing Mommy's neck?" The little girl's voice became smaller, more tentative. "Mommy fell down and didn't move anymore. Her eyes were open, but she wasn't looking at anything. Like when my goldfish died, but scarier because goldfish are supposed to die, but mommies aren't." The analogy, delivered with the brutal honesty of childhood, left the courtroom in stunned silence. Even the court officers, accustomed to hearing detailed accounts of violent crimes, exchanged glances of disbelief at the stark simplicity with which Emma described her mother's near-death experience. David Miller's attorney made a desperate decision to interrupt the flow of testimony. "Objection, Your Honor," Hayes said, rising from his chair. "This line of questioning is clearly traumatizing the witness, and the court has a duty to protect the welfare of this child. I request an immediate recess." Judge Williams considered the objection carefully. She could see that Emma was indeed reliving traumatic memories, but the child seemed remarkably stable in Rex's presence. More importantly, this might be the only opportunity for Emma to tell her story in a legal context. "Objection overruled," Williams ruled. "The witness appears to be managing well with her support animal, and her testimony is clearly relevant to the charges. We'll continue, but I'll be monitoring the situation closely." Rodriguez nodded gratefully and turned back to Emma. "Did you tell Rex what you did when you saw Mommy fall down?" "I was really scared, so I went back into my hiding place with the coats, but I kept watching through the crack because I wanted to make sure Mommy was okay. That's when I saw Daddy kicking Mommy in her tummy, even though she wasn't moving." The description of David Miller kicking his unconscious wife sent a wave of audible gasps through the gallery. Several domestic violence advocates who had come to observe the historic proceedings wiped tears from their eyes, while court reporters from local television stations scribbled furiously in their notebooks. "Did Daddy see you watching?" Rodriguez asked, knowing this detail could be crucial for establishing Emma's credibility as a witness. Emma shook her head. "No, but I thought he might, so I closed my eyes really tight and tried to be super quiet. I heard more crashing sounds and breaking sounds, and then I heard the door slam really hard. After that, it was quiet for a long time, but I was too scared to come out." The timeline Emma was describing matched perfectly with the police reports and the neighbors' statements about when they heard the commotion and when it stopped. Her innocent account was corroborating every piece of physical evidence the prosecution had collected. Rodriguez knew he was approaching the most crucial part of Emma's testimony, the part that would either definitively convict David Miller or leave reasonable doubt in the jury's minds. He took a deep breath and prepared to ask the questions that would determine whether justice would be served. "Emma, one last thing to tell Rex," he said gently. "When Daddy left that night, what did you do then?" Emma's answer would complete the picture of that horrific evening and seal her father's fate once and for all. 6 months after the gavel fell on David Miller's conviction for attempted murder and aggravated domestic violence, Emma Miller sat in the sunlit living room of her new apartment, carefully arranging a tea party for her stuffed animals and one very special guest. Rex lay on the carpet beside her, wearing a small paper crown she had made during their art therapy session, his tail wagging gently as Emma poured imaginary tea into tiny plastic cups. "Here's your tea, Mr. Rex," Emma said in her clear, confident voice, a voice that had grown stronger with each passing day since the trial. "Be careful. It's very hot." The German shepherd played his part perfectly, lowering his massive head to sniff delicately at the miniature teacup, which made Emma giggle with pure delight. These weekly visits from Rex and Officer Lisa Park had become the highlight of Emma's week, a continuation of the therapeutic relationship that had quite literally given her back her voice and helped heal the deepest wounds of that terrible night. Rebecca Miller sat on the nearby couch, watching her daughter with a mixture of profound gratitude and protective love. The physical scars from David's assault had healed, the broken ribs had mended, the facial fractures had been surgically repaired, and even the worst of the bruising had faded to nothing. But the emotional healing had been a longer journey, one that was still ongoing for both mother and daughter. "Mommy, look," Emma called out, holding up a drawing she had made during her session with Dr. Rebecca Chun earlier that week. "I drew." Rex wearing his special vest, and that's me talking to the judge lady, and that's you getting better in the hospital. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears as she studied her daughter's artwork. The drawing showed remarkable emotional progress, instead of the dark, chaotic scribbles that had characterized Emma's early artistic expressions. This picture was filled with bright colors, clear figures, and most importantly, smiles on everyone's faces. Even the representation of the courtroom, which could have been a source of ongoing trauma, was depicted as a place where good things happened. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Rebecca said, accepting the drawing and adding it to the growing collection on their refrigerator. "Rex looks very handsome in his crown." Officer Lisa Park arrived for their scheduled visit, carrying a small wrapped package, which immediately caught Emma's attention. Over the months since the trial, Park had watched Emma transform from a traumatized, silent child into a vibrant, communicative little girl who was not only thriving, but actively helping other children who found themselves in similar situations. "I have something special for you today," Park announced, settling onto the carpet beside Emma and Rex. "Do you remember when we talked about how Rex helps other children who are scared, just like he helped you?" Emma nodded eagerly. "He's a helper dog, and he makes scared kids feel brave." "That's right. Well, the police department wanted to thank you for being so brave and helping us understand how important dogs like Rex are for children who need to tell their stories. So we got you something special." Emma unwrapped the package with the excited energy of any 3-year-old receiving a gift, her eyes widening with delight when she discovered a miniature version of Rex's therapy dog vest, sized perfectly for her stuffed rabbit. "Now Mr. Bunny can be a helper too," Park explained, helping Emma put the tiny vest on her beloved stuffed animal. "Just like Rex helped you find your voice, Mr. Bunny can help other children when they're scared." The symbolism wasn't lost on Rebecca, who understood that this gift represented something much larger than a simple toy. Emma was being recognized not just as a victim who had survived trauma, but as a brave individual whose courage had paved the way for other children to receive justice. Dr. Chan's assessment reports, which had been shared with child advocacy organizations across the country, documented remarkable progress in Emma's psychological recovery. A selective mutism had completely resolved. Her nightmares had decreased significantly, and most importantly, she had developed healthy coping mechanisms for processing difficult emotions. The case had become a landmark study in trauma recovery and had led to the establishment of therapy dog programs in family courts throughout Arizona. "Dr. Chun says I'm helping make new rules for kids who have to talk to judges," Emma announced, proudly adjusting her stuffed rabbit's new vest. "She says because I was brave with Rex, other kids can have helper dogs too." Indeed, the Miller case had established legal precedent that was being studied and implemented nationwide. Judge Patricia Williams had been invited to speak at conferences across the country about accommodating special needs witnesses, and her decision to allow Rex in the courtroom had been cited in dozens of subsequent cases involving child witnesses. The ripple effects extended far beyond the legal system. Rex had become something of a celebrity in the therapy dog community, inspiring the training of additional victim assistance dogs and leading to increased funding for such programs. His success with Emma had proven that the bond between traumatized children and specially trained animals could unlock testimony that traditional methods might never access. But perhaps the most significant change was in Emma herself. The little girl who had once been locked in traumatic silence was now an active, engaged child who spoke freely about her experiences when appropriate, had formed healthy relationships with the adults in her life, and most remarkably, showed genuine concern for other children who might be facing similar challenges. As the afternoon visit concluded and Park prepared to leave with Rex, Emma ran to get something from her bedroom. She returned carrying a hand-drawn card that showed a small girl standing beside a large dog, both of them smiling. "This is for Rex," she announced, carefully placing the card in Park's hands. "To say thank you for teaching me that my voice is important." Park knelt down to accept the card, her own eyes filling with tears. "Rex thinks your voice is very important too, Emma, and so do all the other children you've helped by being so brave." As the door closed behind their visitors, Rebecca hugged her daughter close, marveling at the resilience of childhood and the power of healing when the right support is provided. Emma had not just survived her trauma, she had transformed it into something that could help others. David Miller remained in prison, serving a 15-year sentence that would keep him away from his family and ensure that he received the anger management and psychological treatment he desperately needed. But his conviction, devastating as the circumstances had been, had ultimately created something positive, a legal framework that would protect countless other children and a little girl who had found her voice and learned to use it for justice. In the quiet of their safe, sunny apartment, Emma continued her tea party, chattering happily to her stuffed animals about their day, her voice clear and strong, a testament to the healing power of love, patience, and one very special therapy dog named Rex.